My topic today, Nancy asked me to talk specifically about gathering and analysing evidence. That seems to be a good place to focus wherever you are in your formative assessment implementation, because that is the core of the work. It isn't the only aspect of formative assessment. Now let's just have a quick revision here, because as you know, that the research on formative assessment, it's not just about gathering and analysing evidence. What else makes formative assessments effective? Raise your hands. Yes. Feedback from whom? Feedback. That's the central piece here. This is why we're getting the evidence to give feedback to the teacher about where the students are, so they can do something with that feedback, and also provide feedback to the students. Students provide feedback to each other as well. So those are really important, that centerpiece of feedback. And this is one of the means through which teachers get feedback about their instruction and the kids' learning. And actually about the kids' learning, because we can instruct, but it doesn't necessarily mean the students are learning, right? Would you agree with that? Yeah, you can do all you like, but sometimes they just don't learn. So this is a way of making sure that students are on track, they are moving forward, they're getting to where you want them to be. Some kids are going to take longer than others, for sure, but you want everybody moving in the same direction. So this is going to be our focus, gathering and analysing evidence. And you'll notice that I don't say giving tests, because we know in formative assessment you can use a test, but a score isn't really going to give you much help. Could you... So I'm going to talk to you next, please. The three areas of my focus today are, first of all, why do we need to collect evidence? And I think we all know that. And the second is, how do we do it? And the third is, when do we do it? So these are going to be the areas of focus for us today. So next slide, please. Yeah, so if we look at this slide, this is not what we're going for in evidence. Okay, can you see it? I hope this year's tests are more precise. My son's math score is 342.736. That's one more number beyond the decimal point than last year. So that's not what we're going for. Why? Why are we not going for that in formative assessment? Go ahead, Susie. Perfect. It doesn't tell you what they've learned, what they've accomplished, what they still need to work on. It may be a summative judgment that they've reached a particular point, but it doesn't tell you how they got there, what they still need to work on. So while scores might be useful for summative evaluations, they're not very useful in the context of formative assessment. So let's think about why we need to collect evidence. And I want to go... Yes, please, Nancy. Why? Thank you. Again, please. Thank you. I want to start off by looking at the Common Core and thinking back to the idea of that scores are not going to help us in terms of deciding what to do next to keep that learning going in the right direction. So this is from a mathematical scholar, Judith Muscovich from University of Santa Cruz. And she's done an analysis. Lots of people have done analysis of the Common Core, but she's done a very nice analysis. And certain things that I think are worth drawing our attention to. So first of all, that the Common Core needs to balance conceptual understanding and procedural fluency. That no longer can we just focus on, even if you ever were focused on procedural fluency, kids have to have conceptual understanding so they can apply mathematical understandings to different contexts, right? You would all agree with that. So it's this balance between, yes, we want them to have procedural fluency because in the end that's efficient, but if they don't have the conceptual underpinnings, then the likelihood of them being able to transfer and problem solve, which is where the hallmark of real learning is pretty unlikely. I always remember a fourth grade student, no, she was fifth grade actually in my school, and she did the most elaborate, she was in Kumon math, she did the most elaborate algorithm solving of a fractions problem, and I asked her to explain it, and she couldn't. She could do anything computationally, but she couldn't explain. And so the chances of her being able to think about that in another context and use her as a problem-solving tool, which is what we're going for, was a bit of a challenge. Next one, please. So they have to connect these two types of knowledge, make those connections between the understanding and the procedural fluency. That's a big part of the Common Core. Yes, please. And maintain high cognitive demand. And high cognitive demand is all through the Common Core, as you well know, ELA and mathematics, so that all students are engaged in tasks of high cognitive demand at all times. And I think that's a good way for you to think about your teaching, or if you're an administrator, to think about your teachers. Am I engaging my students, all of them, right now in this lesson in tasks of high cognitive demand? Because if I'm not, I should be doing something else. So that's a good lens, I think, to think through. Kids have to communicate their reasoning about concepts. Another big piece of the Common Core is higher order thinking and reasoning as part of that. So communicate reasoning. So a lot of opportunities for children to talk and use language as a tool for learning. So communicating that reasoning. And I thought the slides you showed, Nancy, were a great example that you could see from that graphic representation on the desk, the kids' reasoning, and then getting them to explain their reasoning, how they come to put those words in those particular positions or those particular circles, will be extremely helpful to a teacher in thinking about where kids were relative to what he wanted them to learn. So communicating reasoning, developing students' beliefs that mathematics is worth doing, it's worthwhile. And I'm sure I'm not talking about anybody in this room, but I have to say in my career, I've been in a lot of classrooms where kids are clueless about the worth of what they're doing. So building that set of beliefs with kids that, yes, I can do math, math is worthwhile, there's value in doing math. And I want to learn. I want to be here, and I want to learn. And then this whole area of mathematical practices. And there's two I've particularly pulled out for the purposes of higher thinking. Can you do them too? Reason abstractly and quantitatively, and construct viable arguments and critique the reasoning of others. Now, when we're talking about evidence later on, I want you to keep all this in mind. Because that score on that test, is that going to tell you how the student's connecting the two types of knowledge, communicating reasoning, how they're reasoning abstractly, constructing viable arguments? It may tell you what they're able to achieve relative to a particular test, but in terms of the ongoing instruction in the classroom, you need more than a score. Okay? So let me just pause there for you math people. Can you put it back, Nancy? Who are the math people in the room? Okay, so what would you add to that? What would you take away? What would you comment for your colleagues on that? What I've just said about the emphases in the Common Core math.
I think it's pretty close to it. So what we talked about before, what they set out to do as far as going deeper in each standard.
Mm-hmm. That you're already focused on. And you had the core word there, going deep. This is about deep learning, higher levels of thinking and deep learning. And this is where we need to go as a country. I mean, we're not doing all this Common Core for nothing. We need to do this to be viable economically and to have citizens who can get the jobs they need that are going to be worth having. Anything else on the math? Yes, go ahead.
The first half of my career was in vocational education, teaching mathematics for machine technologists, electrical engineering, that sort of thing, at a vocational school. So that pragmatic use of math there took kids that didn't achieve, coming from where I'm teaching now, and bring them to a setting where they saw the, the usefulness of it, where the application was, and and continue to influence the kind of problems I try to do with kids now, because I have that background. I think most of our math education, though, doesn't prepare the classroom teacher to have access to that. I mean, there's ways we can go find it now, but that background has continued to be valuable to me.
Yeah.
I think lots of teacher preparation is not geared towards that. I don't think people have the vocational knowledge to go say to them, well, here's why you need to know this, and I mean, that was very valuable for me individually.
Yeah.
But I think it's something we need to emphasize in teacher education beyond in our regular high schools. That just take place in vocational.
That's a really good point. Thank you for sharing that they need to understand that this has some relevance to their lives beyond the here and now. And also that teachers know how to build in these applications. So you got a real advantage for that. Yeah, we can lay a lot at the door of teacher education. I speak as somebody who used to be a teacher educator. Well, I still am, I guess. Susie, this table is really working hard. Where did you come from? Oh, it's the candy. I thought maybe they just had the easy drive over, or they'd had to get up so early.
Actually, is there a prize for farthest distance travel? Because we might have.
Oh my goodness, farthest distance travel, doing the most work. Goodness me, what a role model you are. Schools cancelled? Oh, can you believe these people? So Susie.
I was just going to say that developing student beliefs, you can see that in the Common Core, the way they make connections to college and career. That's built in, throughout both the ELA and the math standards. That are you making connections to real life problem solving? Are you making connections to real life uses? And that's built into the Common Core. We need to address it.
Absolutely, yeah. So this is going to be the background for us to be thinking about collecting evidence, because it's evidence of this kind of stuff that we need. Okay? So let's look at ELA for those people. Who is the ELA people? Must be the rest of you then. Well, there must be a lot of non-math and non-ELA people in this room then. What are the others of you? What? Stalkers, right. Okay, let's look at ELA then. And this is, this is a very good website. It's a group out of Stanford. It's called Understanding Language. And it's a group, I'm part of this group, that is involved in helping teachers think about the Common Core and ELs. So if you have ELs, and even if you don't have ELs, it's really worth looking at. There's a good series of papers, including a brilliant one by me and a colleague, that you should all read. It's just fantastic. But Susan Pimental is part of the group, and she's one of the authors of the Common Core, as you know. So this is their synthesis of the ELA challenges. Engage with complex text to build knowledge across the curriculum. I think you've heard that a million times. How are you doing with your science colleagues and your PE colleagues and your social studies colleagues in terms of helping them to understand that it's their job to build these complex skills in reading in their disciplines? But also, if you're an ELA teacher, you're going to have a particular responsibility for that. Next slide, next bullet, please, Nancy. Good morning, welcome. Using evidence to inform, argue, and analyze. Think about the comparisons with mathematics. Using evidence, justifying your work using evidence, analyze. These higher level cognitive skills are being... Oh, do come forward, please. No need. Okay, next. Speaking and listening, working collaboratively, understanding multiple perspectives and ideas. And this working collaboratively is a big theme in the Common Core. A big theme. And it's not just putting kids in a group, as you well know, and saying, get on with it. It's structures that build opportunities for kids to build on each other's thinking, to challenge each other's ideas, to give feedback, all of this working collaboratively. And then the last one is develop and use the linguistic resources to do all of the above. So language. How are kids using and developing language? And this isn't just for ELs. All students need to have the opportunity to develop complex language, both in speaking and in written form, to express ideas, to argue, to analyze, to reason, all these higher level skills which are right across the Common Core. So ELA people, can you go back a sec? Am I going too slow? No. Okay, so ELA folks, what would you add or comment on what we've got here? Basically thinking about gathering evidence. This is all to prep you for gathering evidence. What would you say here? Go ahead.
I would say that scaffolding is still important and even more important than it ever was. And some have mistakenly held this unfound fear that we have to do everything on grade level. But, you know, the idea of scaffolding is very, I couldn't do a word count, but it's all over the place.
Oh yeah, scaffolding, because that's what you do with evidence. You get evidence and you have to scaffold kids to another level. Remember, you're getting the evidence while they're still learning, not when they're done. You're getting evidence while they're still learning, and your job is to scaffold that learning to take it to a level where they're meeting the goal that you have for them. Shelley?
I'd also say to include every single thing you said about math. In terms
In here,
of
yes.
concepts and thinking in the abstract.
Yeah. Very good. Concepts. Reasoning from evidence. That's across the board and in the science standards as well. Science framework. Reasoning from evidence. Yeah, the same conceptual. So we're notching it up, folks. How many of you have actually started Common Core implementation? Some? Just beginning. Baby steps. Well, that's a good place to be, to take baby steps. And I think that's encouraging, because what scares me, I don't know if you know that, I can't remember who funded him, but Bill Schmidt did a lot of interviews with teachers who said, well, the Common Core is really no different from what we're already doing. So I think those teachers are in for a bit of a shock. And this was thousands and thousands of teachers. So I think baby steps is the way to do it. But what I'm arguing here is the reason you need to collect evidence is because it's not about plowing through the chapter or plowing through the textbook. We've got to give kids opportunities to develop concepts, to reason, to work at a high level of cognitive demand in all areas. And I always remind people who are in these non-tested, non-Common Core subjects that their responsibility is to support these levels of thinking in their areas as well. So it's not like, well, I can sit back because I'm an art teacher or I do shop. That your job is to support this level of thinking as well, and this skill development, and the language development. So, we need evidence of all of these dimensions of learning as it is unfolding in the classroom during the lesson. Now remember, formative assessment is during, not after. It's while the kids are learning, so that you can help them learn what you want them to learn. Okay? When you evaluate it at the end of a sequence of learning to see what's been achieved, that's a summative assessment. And you assign a grade or whatever you do. But formative, when you're doing formative evidence, it's getting it while stuff's still going on in their head, so you can take it to that level and help them reach where you want them to be. And I have a really good answer for the kids that have reached grade level. You keep them going, okay? Because what does this argue for? And I'm sure I said this last time. So Do you think what's going on in Anne's head and Shelley's head and Susie's head and Greg's head is exactly the same right now? I can't treat them like a blob. I've got to know, and so I've got to know what Anne's thinking, how she's reasoning, so I can help her advance her reasoning. Same with Greg. Same with Shelley. So formative assessment is also a way in which you differentiate learning. Now, it doesn't mean to say you're doing one-on-one instruction, but all your kids are not going to be in the same place. And so, to my mind, if one child in your class has reached a point, why should that child be the teacher for the others? I don't think that's right. I think that child has the right to keep on moving. Personal opinion. Okay, so what we need, remember that first slide I showed you, is not decimal points. We need substantive insights. And as one of our greatest assessment experts in the country says, we need substantive insights, not scores. Okay? So make sure you've got that written down. Make sure it's on your forehead, in your brain, that what you are trying to get from evidence is substantive insights. Got that? Could I have people looking a bit more like they've got it? Okay. What? We need substantive insights. I need to know what's going on in here. Okay? Probably not much, right, Greg? Hey, before anybody starts bellyaching about time, my body time, it's 7:25, just so you know. So, I want you to really, really, really think about that. And when you're looking at the work this afternoon, that's one of the things I want you to think about. Am I getting substantive insights or substantive insights into how kids are thinking? Because that's what we're going for in the Common Core. Yes?
Just for example, I was helping a teacher do an item analysis, and half the kids picked B, half the kids picked C. The correct answer was B. We went back to the question and said, why did it, had it been random, it would have been completely different. But actually, more kids picked the wrong answer and the same wrong answer. So that was the insight.
Right.
The score was you got it wrong.
Right.
The insight was, what was about that question, or maybe the way I taught it, that caused more than half the kids to pick the same wrong answer.
Yeah. And that's great. That's a great example. That it's not just check right, check wrong, but why? Why is this kid thinking in this way, or half the class thinking in this way?
I can tell you why. It was fourth grade, and the question was for antonym, not synonym. And they didn't see antonym. They just went for the same meaning.
Yeah. So it was kind of a careless mistake.
But they all made the same.
But the same careless mistake. Yeah, interesting. So it's exactly that kind of thing. And remember, that's why I started with the Common Core, because this isn't about Mickey Mouse stuff. This is about really high-level stuff that we want all kids to achieve. And we're not talking about gifted and talented. We're talking about every single kid in your class or your school or your district. So, insights into thinking, so that we can raise the bar. We can keep kids moving to where we want them to be. Now, I can't remember if I showed you this last time. Have you seen this before? Did I show it you? Yeah. So I just want to remind us of what formative assessment is doing here. Okay, we start the lesson. And remember, formative assessment isn't about the unit. It's about the lesson. 2, 3 periods, 1 period, however long you think this particular segment of instruction will take. So you set a goal. And remember, you set a goal that is within the student's reach. Not too easy, not too hard. Okay, we've gone through that before. So what do we have between where the kid starts the lesson, the current learning status, and where you want them to go? What's it called in the formative assessment world? It's written up there. The gap. Not an achievement gap. We're not talking about achievement gaps, we're talking about the gap between where I start, where my kids start, and where I want them to end up. So a gap's a good thing. Now, I'm going to give them some instruction. I'm going to plan some learning experiences, we're going to have activities, we're going to have discussion, they're going to do collaborative tasks, whatever. And because I'm so fabulous at instruction, look what happens. Their current learning status moves, but they're not yet where I want them to be. So in this darker orange, I'm going to be using formative assessment at the same time as instruction so that I can make those instructional adjustments, provide the necessary feedback that's going to close the gap. And that's the purpose of the evidence. The only way I know where the kids are currently, if they've moved at all, or where they've moved to, or what they're not understanding, or what they've partially grasped, what they've got a fragmentary understanding of, I've got to do something the best as I can to get inside their heads. Now, this isn't an exact science, of course. This is your best guess, based on the evidence you get. But you're professionals, that's why you get paid the big bucks. So, can we just go back to that? Because I just want to sit with that for a minute, because this is the essence of what we're talking about today here. Does anybody have any comments or questions on this graphic? Any confusions?
I have a question about, and maybe this is something we'll get into later, I don't want to derail anything, but what happens for a student whose gap is between what I'm being told his learning goal needs to be, his or hers, and where they are? They have some gap in their learning from that it's supposed to be something that they were learning in a previous year. What's the solution?
Well, I call those holes in learning previously, so as we don't get confused. But I think if kids aren't moving, you've given them instruction, you're checking where they are and they're not moving, then there has to be some more probing that could reveal, oh my goodness, this kid didn't understand some of these prerequisites that they really need. That, of course, ladies and gentlemen, means you have to be clear what those prerequisites are, what they need to come into this lesson with. Now, in that case, can you keep on going, doing the same as everybody else? Of course not. You have to plug those holes for the kid. If that is the piece that's preventing this child from moving forward, that's what you have to address. Because just keeping this kid going with everybody else isn't serving this child's needs. And so you plug that hole. And hopefully when you plug that hole, you'll find that there's some acceleration in that learning. There may not be, but you have to start where the kids are, not where you want them to be.
Time-wise, do you find that that's a detriment as far as, if you're moving someone along this, if you're moving most of the kids along at a certain speed and there are 2 or 3, that you have to plug that hole, and then you want to still move them toward the learning goal? I mean, is that where you're making an attempt to take the kids that have reached the goal, push them higher while you're waiting for the others that to...
Well, I think you have to. I don't know if you heard, sorry, what's your name? Tobin, what Tobin was saying. What do you do with these kids who aren't keeping up with the pack? I think you've got to be a very nimble teacher to do that. You can't keep them with all the other kids and give them exactly the same diet, because they're not going to get it. They're not going to achieve what you want them to achieve. But at the same time, you can't run a subclass for 2 kids. So I think you've got to be very skilled about finding ways to plug these holes. And then as you're moving the rest along, you have to be skilled enough to be able to fold these kids back in. And it might be through asking other children to give explanations, which I do believe is a very good thing for them to do, no matter how advanced they are. Asking them to do explanations, doing some paired work where you're giving them support, and still pulling them on one side. So I think in some ways you plug the holes, you have to keep moving forward, but remember you've got these kids who you need to fold in some way. I really think it's a child's right in a school to be taught at the level they're at. And I think if we think about it in those terms, I'm me. I'm not anybody else. I'm not who you want me to be. I'm not at the level you might want me to be. But I'm here and you're my teacher. And your job is to support me from wherever I am. And formative assessment is one way you can do that. I had a couple of teachers I worked with in Syracuse, and they had an inclusion class, 2 of them team teaching. And what they said, and forgive me, I can't remember if I showed you the video or not, but what they said was that when they targeted the instruction right where the kid was, it would be a quick fix. That's the word she used, is a quick fix. And they're talking about an inclusion class. This is a quick fix because you're right where the kid is. And so she said, I mean, and they told me that they'd been teaching together for a while, and they'd never seen their kids advance so much as they had in the couple of years that they'd really got good at formative assessment. Because as I said, they could tweak something, they could fix it right there and then move forward. I think what you want to be is a nimble teacher. I'm sure you all are nimble teachers, but there's degrees of nimbleness. You have to be responsive to who you've got in front of you, not who you'd like to have. Any other comments or questions? Great question. I mean, that's the big challenge of being a teacher, right? That's the sort of fundamental. How am I meeting the needs of all my kids in my class simultaneously? Tough, yes?
Yeah, I have a special ed teacher who, we were talking about students learning, and her students who all have IEPs. Some of them have maybe IQs of 70. Mm-hmm. And she was talking about their short-term memory and the deficits in that. Mm-hmm. And you know, how she just didn't know how to bring those students forward enough because they couldn't retain things that she had taught many times.
Well, I'm not a special ed teacher, but boy, we've all been. I remember my prime kid, his name was Ronnie Brown. He must be about 45 with grandchildren now. But Ronnie Brown couldn't remember one thing from one day to the next. I wish I had a good answer for you. I just don't. I think you have to bring everything you've got to bear. But what I found with Ronnie, he might not be able to remember things, but if I got him to work with materials and try to understand why things worked, he was better than at actually trying to remember, you know, a procedure or something like that. So it's trying to get sort of deep and give them some kind of conceptual base to work from. That was from my own experience. Every child's different. But I'm certainly not standing up here as the goddess of teaching, as you've probably figured out. But I do believe that our children have the right to be attended to from where they are. So we'll keep this theme going. You had something, sorry.
I just wanted to clarify, am I right in thinking that this model would be individual for each student? This isn't a model for a class, it's for each kid has a different learning status, so each kid would have a different goal.
Well, I don't think you're going to have a different goal for every kid in the class. I think that would be problematic, yeah. You're going to have a different gap, yeah. Sometimes you may have a different goal. I mean, one wonderful elementary teacher, she works with cognitively guided instruction. I don't know if you do that in Ohio. But she will be working on the same concept, but give kids different numbers to work with depending on their understanding of place value. They're still working on the same problems, but the numbers are different. So it's that kind of differentiation, but it's the gap. You can't have a separate goal for all kids. You may have 2 or 3 goals going, but not one for all kids. But the gap, what I'm proposing here is the gap is going to be different. And that's where your evidence will help. Okay, Nancy, let's go. Thank you for raising that. That clarifies things for everybody. Okay, so how do we collect evidence? Keep going. Okay, so I've kept saying that we go for what's in people's heads. So how do we do it? Well, I'm sure one day when we're all pushing up the daisies, they'll have brain scans, we'll be able to look at brain waves, and we'll just know exactly what's going on. We're not there yet. So we have to externalize. So Patrick Griffin, an Australian scholar, talks about the way that humans can provide evidence of their learning, of their thinking, is by what they say, what they do, what they make, and what they write. And I would like you to keep those 4 ideas in mind. Because I've talked about the use of language, getting kids to reason. They've got to be talking. You've got to be listening to discourse. What they write, ELA is full of what they write, mathematics is full of what they write. How they express their reasoning in oral language and in written language. What they make, we saw that in Nancy's slides, the graphic organizer. They were making a graphic organizer to help reflect their thinking and what they do. So the actual physical performances, it could be role play, it could be something they do in a model making. That's probably more like what they make, but more the physical aspects of what they do. And they're observable, they're externalized, and your job, our job, is to give them ways in which they can reveal their learning right at that moment in the lesson so that that gap can be closed. Okay? Now, I think I gave you the bad news last time that this has to be planned. That when I showed you the lesson last time, that it's not something you can just think, oh, in the course of this instruction, I'm going to check on them, I'll look for the deer in the headlights look. Remember what I said? Substantive insights. That's what we need if we're going to get kids to reach the Common Core. So, we need planned. Now, that doesn't mean that we can't have spontaneous on the fly. Sometimes it's called on the fly. That something's happening over here that I hadn't planned, but I think, oh my goodness, this really shows me that they're thinking about something, or they're discussing something, or they're reasoning about it in a particular way that I hadn't planned to reveal. But here it is. So I'm going to use it. But we go back to the learning goal and the success criteria, which I hope I will see all over your stuff here, that if you're not clear about what the kids are learning, you're not clear how you'll know if they're learning, then it's going to be very difficult for you to both get the evidence and interpret it. So again, those learning goals and success criteria are critical. So planned into the lesson. Okay, now I'll stop talking for a second, and I want you and your group to come up with some ideas of ways in which you have gathered evidence yourself or seen other people gathering evidence that would fit the say, do, make, or write categories. So see what you can come up with in your groups. I'll give you 3 or 4 minutes to chat about that. Okay, so just wind up your conversations and we'll come back together as a group. So I'm going to be interested to hear what you had to say. And I'll start us off, and then I'd like you to add to what I have here. So eliciting evidence. Oh, and by the way, as it was mentioned here, sorry, what's your name? What Kelly mentioned is you don't necessarily have to do all 4 in one lesson. It's what is the best way to get in here right now. So it may just be that the whole time you're just listening to what they say. Or perhaps another lesson you're watching them do something. So doesn't necessarily have to be all the same time. So what students say? Questioning, discussion. What else would you add to that? Good questions. And yes, Sherry, Susie? Explanations, getting kids explanations, absolutely. Mathematics, language arts, remember explaining their analysis, explaining their evidence, explaining their reasoning. We need to have a lot of explaining going on. Anything else? Add to what they say.
Would the peer review they do of each other, would that be considered what they say, if you're listening to that?
Yeah, I think that's a great way of getting information about learning, if you're listening to the exchanges that the children have with each other about their work. So that peer feedback, if you're doing intentional listening in, okay, to get some insights into how they're thinking. What students write. Student written work from their instructional tasks, or you might give prompted written responses. What else would you add to that? The graphic organizers, yep. Yeah, go ahead.
Linking those two together, you get into probing questions in the first one, and then as you go to the second one, I think could be added in here would be what students write as feedback to other students. As far as peer review, you mentioned peer review, I think linking those two, you go deeper with something, getting a kid to explain why they thought that, and say, hey, that's really good. Everybody write that on everybody's paper or project, whatever they got right now.
Yeah.
Put that down.
Yeah.
Write a note to them. Getting them to write good thoughts that other kids have, whether it's math or language, would make a difference.
Yeah, again, I think the feedback they give to each other would be really helpful, as you said. And I also, I'm glad you raised that about putting the two together, because, as I'll say later, oh golly, better get moving. The idea is that you need enough evidence to make a decision. So sometimes the written work might not be enough, that you want to ask those probing questions at the same time. Okay, so what they make, models, representations, diagram charts, organizers. Anything else to add? Yes? Yeah, great. What they make, web pages, Facebook pages, whatever technology opportunities they have. Anything else? What were you talking about in this table when you were talking, Anne, to the person next to you about the notes she wrote? The lady in the green there? What do you write notes about?
Just when kids are working in small groups, I'll carry a board or a notebook with me just to kind of jot down so that later I can go back and say, John didn't understand this, so I can touch base with him later.
You can touch base. So you're keeping that record as you're listening into the discussions. Yeah, great. And then what they do. So manipulations, web-based tools. And how many of you use clickers? Do you use clickers in your schools? Do you know what I mean by clickers? Yeah? Role play. The kind of demonstrations they might do in, some of the disciplines where they have to do more physical performances. Anything else that we haven't talked about in there? We covered everything?
I think an important distinction is also one of my teachers, what can they do independently? Because unless they can do it independently, you really don't know what they can do.
Right. This is, can they do something independently? That's important. But what we're trying to do is to get evidence before they can do it independently, so we make sure they end up being able to do it independently. But you're right, it's a good distinction. Okay, so a few things to remember now about gathering evidence. First thing is, it needs to be planned. This isn't something that you just figure out as you're going along. First thing to remember, alignment. What am I aligning my evidence gathering strategies with? Your goals, not your instruction. Your success criteria, which your instruction is going to be centered around. Yeah. You've already decided how you're going to know if they're learning what you want them to learn. So then you better figure out a way of getting that evidence. So alignment. This is the core of any assessment. You know, the state's tests have to be aligned with the standards. The district benchmarks have to be aligned with the standards. Your evidence has to be aligned with the learning goal and the success criteria. Alignment, because you're not going to get the evidence you need if it's not aligned. Okay, so let's see, matching the strategy. So if I want to know if a student can explain the author's point of view and how this author distinguishes his position from others, I'm going to need them to explain something. Okay? If I want to know if students can reason abstractly about a particular mathematical concept, I better give them the opportunity to do that. So having your learning goal and your success criteria in alignment with your evidence gathering is essential. Then the next thing, opportunities for all students. Formative assessment is about every single kid in your class. Opportunities for all students to show where they are. That means that I can't do the same thing over and over again. Plus, I've got to make sure whatever the opportunity is, it's sufficiently broad enough so that it's going to bring in everybody in the class. Now, the kind of questioning I just did back then when I said, what do you need to be aligned with, is not the kind of questioning I want you to be doing in your classrooms, which I'm sure you don't anyway. This one-word response, going around till we get the correct answer. It's the kind of questioning that's going to give me an opportunity to figure out, to hear an explanation, to hear a comment, to hear something that's going to help me figure out how you're thinking. Not getting, and I'm sure you know the typical standard questioning and responses, the IRE, where you the teacher asks a question, the children respond, and then there's an evaluation. Yes, that's right. No, that's wrong. Oh, nearly. Let's move to Anne here. Can you help him out, Anne? Can you get the right answer? We're back to substantive insights. That's not giving me a substantive insight. So lots of opportunities for kids to be fairly broad-gauged in the assessment strategy so you can figure out where little Johnny is and where little Mary is. Opportunities for all. Next, please, Nancy. So that when do we do this? When do we gather evidence? All right, so let's see. When in this lesson do I need to gather evidence? Before I show you my slide, let's hear. When you're planning, which I'm sure you are, to gather evidence, what's in your mind? What are you thinking? When do I need to get it? What kinds of opportunities or points in the lesson do you think are important? Just shout out, there's no wrong answers, you're all teachers. I'm just an imposter standing up here who once was a teacher. Before you start? Yeah, maybe figure out what are the initial conceptions, what kind of facets of thinking, what kind of holes are there here before you start? During. Okay, but let's probe that a little bit more. When during?
Well, I think that sometimes that depends on your success criteria. If you have placed success criteria in baby steps to get you to that learning goal, then one of the during is after the first baby step, and then the next baby step, and then the next baby step. So I think that it's have you set up the success criteria, or do you expect kids to jump from this chair to that one over there in one big leap? Or have you put in multiple chairs for them to jump to get to that one over there? And where you help them is where that's too big a step for them.
Yeah, that's great. In between the steps of the lesson. Very nice. Or between the chairs. I like that analogy. Where else? When else might you do it? At the end, yes. Because you want to see where they are at the end of the lesson, because you might want to do something differently tomorrow, or get some insights ready for your plans. Or you already have a plan, but you may decide based on today, you are going to change it based on what you get at the end of the lesson, the end of the period. Any others? While they're working independently, that's a good opportunity to go in and figure out. That's a great time, as you were saying, when they're working, you can jot notes, you can look at what they're working, you can ask some questions during independent work time. It's a great opportunity for formative assessment, provided, of course, they're doing something worthwhile that demands some thinking on their part, right? Somebody else, Susie, again?
Yeah, just that you mentioned something about, at the end of the period, or I don't think that there's a teacher in here who teaches 4 of the same subject across the course of the day, or 6 of the same subject across the course of the day. But if we saw that lesson that they did period 1, it looks identical to the lesson that they did period 2. And that lesson out the first time, and when they take it out the 6th time, it's almost a different lesson.
Right.
So I think that plays into where you're making adjustments to your lessons also.
That's a really good point, that you don't roll out the same lesson over and over again. You've made those adjustments, but then the kids are different, so you're going to have to make adjustments within that. But that's very nice, yeah. That's what I mean by nimble teaching. So let's see what I put here then. Let's just go through them, Nancy. Paul Black talks about, I wish I'd got this idea, the rhythm of instruction. I think that's a great way to think about when you collect evidence, in the rhythm of instruction. So it may be critical junctures, it may be the chairs analogy, it may be halfway through the lesson. If the kids haven't understood the first part, there's no point moving on, because you're just going to compound the problem. So maybe it's a point in the lesson during the instructional task, as you were saying, as you go around, before they go to independent work, at the end of the lesson, after a first draft, 15 minutes of independent problem solving. You want them to work on their own, and then we need to have a check. Okay, where are you? So being really planful about the rhythm of your instruction, and to keep that rhythm going smoothly, so that kids are moving along the way you want them to do, collecting evidence needs to be planned. So it's not just how you're going to collect it, but when you're going to collect it. Does that make sense to the planning part of it? And I keep coming back to that Common Core and the kinds of demands we need to be making on our students. And so just keep plowing along isn't going, because that's what's in the textbook, isn't going to work.